if you're open to this idea that moving faster can actually equal better security, as long as you think about things in a deliberate and designed way and an engineered way, you're on a good path.
The difference between just shouting at someone across the room or actually having a conversation and confirming that they've understood and the message has been received.
Actually understanding that entire cycle and taking some responsibility for making sure that the signalling is high quality throughout.
We get so preoccupied by the big black swan events that inherently happen so infrequently to any organisation, let alone your organisation, that it feels an impossible thing to measure.
Good security looks different to different people. So good security to an engineer is very different to good security to a regulator or good security to the C-suite and the board. They've all got different definitions of good security. So you've got to tell that story of what their definition of good looks like.
Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Simon Goldsmith, CISO at digital first energy company OVO. You've had quite a varied career, a load of different roles. What's your journey to CISO been like?
I'd love to say, well, actually, I don't think I would love to say planned, but I think as quite a lot of CISOs say, it's pretty much an accident. There were some kind of seminal moments along the way. So I started out in engineering. I was a mechanical engineer, graduated from university, and then worked for the Fiat Group, based over in Italy, thinking I was going to get a chance to build Alfa Romeos and Lancias and all that kind of stuff, and ended up working on excavators in Turin. So wasn't quite as built, but I had a great time. Really kind of learned that benefit of putting yourself outside your comfort zone and working in a foreign country and foreign language and that sort of thing. And then conflation of things, but pretty much a kind of a 9/11 event. So that happened while I was there. And I felt like my engineering degree wasn't really being used as much as I wanted it to be. I wanted to kind of really build strong engineering foundations and make a difference. And so I joined the UK MOD and came back to the UK, did their graduate engineering program, became chartered engineer, working on electronic warfare for helicopters and a lot about kind of defensive aids and survivability. And that kind of got me into, I guess that was my first taste of physical security, if you like. And then, as I say, kind of seminal moment, external events, and the 20-year anniversary happened recently. 7/7 happened, and I decided I wanted to make a difference, and so joined a company called Detica to go chase terrorists. Didn't quite end up doing what I'd hoped for and I planned. I ended up in cyber, and so ended up chasing different types of criminals and ne'er-do-wells and bad actors across the digital arena. So that was kind of my entry into cyber, building either secure systems in kind of highly classified environments or kind of cybersecurity solutions themselves. And that took me across multiple sectors, critical national infrastructure, different bits of government, and also into financial services, and did a bit of a stint in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing, that sort of stuff.
Pretty wide range of
yeah, and that was kind of the longest stint. Was there for 12 years. And then after that, it was a quick stint in EY and a bit of consulting, and had a great time. Met some amazing people building financial services, doing technical services within kind of financial services organisations across Europe.
Technical services, then pen testing, forensic.
Yeah, and kind of that's really kind of where the DevOps journey really started to solidify, because there was a few of the financial institutions in Europe who are really starting to lean heavily into DevOps, setting up centers of excellence, or kind of actually turning all of their software development lifecycle into much more of a continuous integration, deployment programs, that sort of thing. So going in from a consultancy perspective, but also actually hands-on, trying to work out how you code changes, how you write policy and make kind of policy testable in the code, all of that sort of stuff really started happening around that time. And as I said, lucky enough to bump into a crowd in ISO who, well, it was actually in the Institute of Electric Engineers in the US that kind of kicked it off, and then that became the ISO standard. Spent a little bit. Then Adidas came calling, so it was an opportunity to go work in retail, which I thought would be a little bit different. Felt like I'd be able to have a bigger impact given kind of my experience. And as you said, you measure your experience in decades. You start to kind of, well, how can I help, or how can I find areas where that experience might have a bit more impact? And went into retail, learned a hell of a lot, learned a lot about supply chain, a lot about kind of aligning incentives around the supply chain. Kind of went back to my roots almost, because there was a manufacturing element to my early degree, and learning how to incentivize an entire supply chain in things like quality and security, and that was really informative. And then OVO came calling, and the kind of the combination of an amazing mission to decarbonize the UK grid, with some cracking people, a proper kind of technology powered organization, very technology first. That was the opportunity 4 years ago, and I've been doing that ever since.
Right, wonderful. And I know from some of our previous conversations, there's that you bring a really interesting perspective as well, because of that variety and kind of moving from the physical into kind of digital. And I think you talked about survivability earlier. I know I think you were one of the first people. There's a common image that goes around on social media, right, about bullet holes in planes returning from World War II. But I think you were kind of one of the pre-social media people that would kind of hold up these examples of what to look for and what not to look for, right, in those sorts of things.
I can remember I got into a bit of to whatever extent you can have kind of an online discussion on places like LinkedIn, but somebody posted that the plane with the bullet holes and talked about survivability bias and kind of, how you see a picture like that, and therefore you put the armor plating where the bullet holes are, but actually it's the planes that didn't come home, and therefore those you need to, and you don't have evidence of those, so you don't know actually where to put the armor plating. I remember having this discussion online. We used to kind of get quite critical of that, because the bias was to add armor, and maybe that's not the answer. The answer is a real kind of systems thinking view of, well, wouldn't it be better if you weren't there in the first place, because your intelligence was so good, you actually knew where all the enemy positions were, and so they had no chance of kind of seeing you. And if they see it, it was something called the survivability onion. So essentially, don't be seen, and if you are seen, don't get acquired, and if you are acquired, don't get engaged, and if you are engaged, don't get shot, and if you get shot, don't fall out the sky. It's that kind of, that has, as you say, that's kind of informed that whole kind of systems approach to security as well.
That's a really, really interesting kind of way to approach those kind of problems. And I often kind of joke that if you ask sometimes when you're speaking to security people, and it's like you say, add more armor, if you gave them a plane to design, it would never take off, because it would be just so well protected that it wouldn't be able to actually achieve the mission of kind of taking off in the first place. So
there's a classic story of why Russian. Sorry, yes, it's the classic story of why Russian submarines are so big. It's actually because it's two submarines, one inside the other.
So I suppose that kind of leads on nicely into maybe some of that perspective and like you say, that systems thinking. Does that help how you communicate cyber risk in a way that kind of that kind of onion, peeling back the layers, kind of turning something that's quite technical into a business concern? I think kind of parallel.
I think telling stories is important, and it has. I do probably overuse analogies, and you can kind of take analogies too far, but quite often that is a good way to communicate with someone, break down at least the initial barrier for those that think cyber is only a technical discipline, or is only something that people who understand the technical elements of it need to get their head around. And I think Kieran Martin put it very, very well, where he talked about an oil and gas executive who can get their head around how to extract hydrocarbon from miles underneath kind of the sea or the Earth's crust, yet can't get their head around a firewall. He didn't buy it, and I think I totally. But you've got to get them the route in. You've got to kind of pique that interest and get that kind of route into the. And you've got to find a way to get that engagement going as you get into some of the slightly more technical elements of it, because they do need to understand some of the technical sides of it. I'll take for example the recent attacks against retail by Scattered Spider. It is very useful if you can get your C-suite get their heads around the fact that it's kind of an inversion of the attack model. We used to worry about devices and networks and getting good visibility and getting great detection and response on those. And as a result of kind of doing that, they've inverted that, go after people and identity first, and may never even go anywhere near the device because everything happens in the browser. Now, I don't need to understand the deep technical side of that, but understanding the attack model is inverted, and maybe as a security team, we don't have as much visibility of those attacks as we do of the other types of attacks. And therefore, that's why we need to lean into slightly different ways of doing security. That is a useful story to tell.
Yeah, great. And is there a particular time where where maybe that hasn't worked as well, or you've had to defend the value of a security team or something you're doing where kind of maybe, cyber isn't core to the value proposition, or, how have you gone about kind of defending that, if you like, your program and your team and what you're trying to do and how you're trying to help the business? Because I think often people struggle.
I think that's probably my biggest lesson from working in retail, and particularly kind of B2C retail environments. Security isn't front and center. And so going around and say security first just isn't going to work out well for you. You're going to spend an awful lot of time with senior people who say, look, Simon, why are you trying to make your problem my problem? And it's different if you work in financial services. The original reason people put money in a bank was to keep it safe and secure. So even if it isn't, obviously part of your value proposition, it is part of your value proposition.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of core part of why you exist, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's similar when you're in a B2B environment, and maybe you're building SaaS or whatever. The requirements from customers to get better at security as just a piece of hygiene or security by demand, as kind of CISA talk about it, is just kind of raising all the time. So there you can you've got a hook there for doing even kind of some of the more bureaucratic sides of security. There is value in that because you're arming your salespeople with a value statement around security as part of your product. Now, when you are in a pure kind of retail B2C, it is a slightly different challenge because all of our customers rightly expect a high level of security, but not to the extent that they're going to go and say, right, I'm going to pay, an extra $10 or whatever for a pair of trainers because I know that the supply chain is secure, or I know that my data that I'm putting in to be part of a rewards program or loyalty program. So you've got to find other ways to describe the value of what you're doing, and quite often that is putting it in the mental, and that's putting it in the kind of the mental model of the people that you're speaking to. So say for example, you are speaking to a finance team or a CFO or someone along those lines, and they understand the concept of upside and downside risk. Yeah. So quite often you can tell that story around, well, all security really, and other types of tech risk, but security is the one that I'm here to talk to you today about, is downside risk of all of the things that product owners, product managers in tech, they spend an awful lot of time in maximizing the upside of technology, of the opportunities of technology. I need to have a conversation with you that there's always a downside. There's always the more technology you get into, the more connectivity we have, the more opportunities we're providing to kind of bad actors. And so you need to consider the downside as long as the upside. And then if my value is in a really good description of downside risk, and how we're avoiding permanent loss, then that's kind of a good start for a discussion.
Yeah.
I think
I often
to answer
joke
your question,
that
sorry.
I often joke that kind of if you're talking cyber and digital essentially are the same thing, right? You can have cybersecurity, digital security. You can have, it's kind of like E or I as prefixes to things. E-commerce, I-commerce, digital commerce, cyber commerce, cyberspace, that kind of thing. But it's kind of cybersecurity when it's bad and digital transformation when it's good.
I've quoted you on that before.
That.
I know you've said that before. It's exactly right. Exactly
Um,
right.
so yeah, the kind of my tip for kind of execs and things like that is if someone's talking, if you're sat on a board and something like that, and someone's talking about a digital transformation program and no one's mentioning cybersecurity, then all you've done is talk about the upside and not the downside risk that goes with it, and vice versa.
Exactly right. And I think to your earlier question of where it hasn't gone as well as I'd liked or as I'd planned. I've had very mixed reactions to talking about reputation and trust, and loss of trust and loss of reputation. Sometimes it's landed really well, and that's the thing that I've, rather than risk of permanent financial loss, I've almost led with the trust and the reputation piece and said, look, and this has been with a CFO who, again, very nuanced understanding of risk, and we had this very in-depth conversation around, well, I can hedge against financial loss, I can insure, and I can do all sorts. There's all sorts of mechanisms where I can make sure that the wins outweigh the losses, and then you kind of can bring in the reputation on the trust bit and say there is no hedging of trust.
Yeah.
If you've lost it, you've lost it, and then you're going to work to regain it. But that's for that period that you've lost it, it's gone. That is a permanent loss, and that has been successful. But at the same time, I've had exactly the same conversation, and you can have that. Well, all right, a bit of loss of trust and a bit of loss of reputation, but financially, quite often organisations come out better the other side as a result of a cyber attack. And so again, you just go down an alley you don't want to go down, because the thing you focused on is reputation and trust, and actually it's the permanent loss of revenue that you really need to be talking about.
Presumably that relates back a bit to the kind of culture and context of the organization as well. If we, we're talking a bit about Marks and Spencer earlier, they're a long-standing brand where trust is absolutely core to their kind of identity, if you like. So that I could see resonating quite well in that kind of organization. If you're in, a very revenue centric kind of, if you think kind of fast fashion and things like that, where everything's quite fleeting and coming and going and season by season changing, then I suspect that kind of trust is perhaps less important. And like you say, the bottom line is way more of the thing to lead on. So it's orienting yourself within the context of that organization and its culture is probably
potentially, but I would still say I've been surprised every time. It's kind of, it's almost, I'd say it's almost by individual as opposed to by company or sector.
Have you had that with different members of an exec team where they've got that kind of different perspective?
100%. And I think the stronger indicator is whether an exec has been through an actual cyber incident, like a material cyber event. And it's you can, when you're speaking to them, you can perceive the trauma of that very emotional time of realizing I'm not in control of something that I thought I was in control of before, and this thing is happening and somebody else is leading the narrative, and all of those other things that just make you feel terrible as a victim of a cyber attack. And that's really the strongest indicator that I've seen in senior execs, that you're likely to, how hard you're going to have to work to kind of get the message to land.
Yeah, gotcha. Have you ever, sticking with kind of different, this might be different organizations or different stakeholders, but kind of perceptions around people who perhaps don't want the best security in inverted commas, they're just after kind of good enough security or something like that. Anything How do you handle people like that? Because you presumably want to do the best job that you can, right? And that must, might be
I'd
demotivating.
love to say I did a great job of when I was confronted with exactly that question. I'm going to be really honest. I reacted a little bit emotionally to it and didn't kind of give the answer that I wished I'd given. But
Yeah.
essentially, somebody who shall remain unnamed in a company that will remain unnamed, but it's going to be easy to guess from my background, said, look, we're not a bank, we're not a government, so we don't need to win the race. But I do want to beat these kind of these people that we're competing with in our sector. So how do we end up somewhere in the middle? And as I said, I had quite an emotional reaction to it. I said, look, we've got to be the only team in the entire company who the whole company is about winning. Like all the language, the entire culture is about winning and leading the race. We're the only team who you've come with the most demotivating message on the planet with. I just want you somewhere in the middle. Please just be average.
Yeah.
It's like, so that was kind of, I had to take a bit of a breath. And
what was the answer that you wish you'd given?
Well, I started to get toward the answer, which was, we can be the best team in the sector at tailoring a security strategy to our business strategy and being right for the business context, running that more efficiently, more, faster, leaner than anybody else in the sector. So we can win at aspects of security that maybe you haven't thought about and so that's kind of the route that I went down. Is that the problem is it's very difficult to measure that stuff. It's a fair charge that came back. It's saying, well, you're going to have a team of, I don't know, 60, whereas our competition have a team of 100, and you're going to achieve the same level of security. Well, how do you measure that? And crikey, you can kind of get, security scorecards and all of those kind of external measures, but we both know that those aren't reliable measures of kind of how companies are doing. So yeah, it's much more about, ultimately, to answer your question, I'd almost wished I'd leaned a little bit into sports psychology a little bit more, which is about you get a deeper sense of satisfaction and happiness, essentially, from understanding the journey and really understanding the route that you've taken to get to where you are, and celebrating that kind of continuous improvement, because
step-on-step progress.
Exactly. And sports teams, they go into every weekend knowing that there's a decent chance that they're going to lose, and the really good ones win more often than they lose, but they still lose. And so they find ways of measuring their individual and collective performance that is about continuously kind of improving and getting better than anyone else consistently. And it's that kind of that old Simon Sinek quote of real kind of success is about surviving. And you come back to kind of making your performance resilient, as opposed to winning all the time and never losing against attackers who we know they're always going to register some level of win, right?
We're very, very quick to say there's no such thing as 100% secure, but then kind of beat ourselves up if there's a loss or not perfection. But I'm sure a lot of that will resonate, because I know that security isn't core to lots of industries and lots of organizations, right? And it can be demotivating at times. And I think taking that mindset is quite an important way of kind of, like you say, reframing the problem. And are you being the best at securing your company, and how are you improving? Because continual improvement is central to so many good practices, right? Be it your kind of ISO 27001, pick a framework. It will have some feedback loop and some continual improvement. And I think there's a lot there that we could, as an industry, probably focus more on.
I'll challenge that a little bit. Let's not go down the rabbit hole.
Go on.
But I think it's bolted on to a few frameworks and standards. It's a clause that happens at the end of a standard, as opposed to really baking it into the entire feedback loop and designing your system as a feedback loop, where continuous improvement is actually the loop itself, as opposed to
I think that's
as I say,
entirely
a discipline that you bolt on the end.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely fair. I think the what I was getting at was not necessarily where it sits in the framework, but making it that central thing of like, how do we reflect and show the improvement and measure the improvement that we've made. And like you say, that might be how you're now doing things more effectively or more efficiently with some limited resources. That's still a big win of, versus
And
adding new things on top.
and collectively, right? And I think that's the and we talk about telling stories, and I use user story mapping quite a lot to articulate that good security looks different to different people. So good security to an engineer is very different to good security to a regulator, or good security to the C-suite and the board. They've all got different definitions of good security. So you've got to tell that story of what their definition of good looks like, and deliver capabilities for that story. And equally, the security team themselves are they're a critical part of that. What does good security look like to them? And something we say quite a lot is security folks are far more comfortable with building tools and paved roads and as wayfinders and guides, rather than kind of gatekeepers and people who kind of say no to stuff. Most security folk, I mean, there's probably a minority who do still like the power from that, but the majority want to help the organization be more secure and go faster and be more and build better experiences for their customers. It's they want the same things. There may be some, you got to work through the balance of how to get there.
Are there any, so I think that tailoring your storytelling and like you say, to different stakeholders and particularly asking yourself, well, what does good look like to this group is a really good piece of advice, and kind of common theme where we've been speaking to others as well, that kind of really understanding your audience and kind of dialing it in. Are there different metaphors or analogies? You touched on these earlier. You may be prone to some of those that you use with different groups, or that you found particularly resonate in different ways, or that really landed when it comes to trying to explain some of that complex cybersecurity topic in a way that's accessible.
The boiling frog is a kind of it's a favorite one. Well, it can't be a favorite one of mine because my wife is vegetarian and she tells me off for using it. But the whole boiling frog metaphor of put a frog in some water and gently heat it up, and it won't know it's boiling until you've got a boiled frog, as opposed to putting a frog in an already pot boiling water and it will jump straight back out. It's that. Yeah. That's quite a good metaphor for all of the weaknesses and the exposures and the technical debt, or whatever you want to call it, is accumulating. That's the boiling water. And then, the attacker finding that and exploiting it is the boiling point, or the point that you got the boiled frog. We've just got really poor signaling in security. So we're often relying on signaling from the attackers. So knowing that they've attacked us, and then they're the ones that complete the feedback loop. And so quite often we're trying to introduce artificial signals like pen testing or bug bounties or whatever it is, to try and generate those signals to get the kind of the weaknesses and the exposures discovered and fixed sooner. And we focus quite a lot on that.
As opposed to trying to measure the temperature of the water, or how is that?
Well, I think it's measuring the temperature of the water, but then understanding that there's an entire feedback loop and several steps that security should be responsible for, rather than just measuring the temperature of the water. Okay. So it's that measurement. It's then generating and transmitting that signal in a format that somebody can do something about the temperature of the water, will understand, making sure they've received it and have got the context to actually make a decision, tracking whether they've made the decision, tracking whether they've actually acted on the decision. If they haven't acted on it, resending that signal. So that kind of that amplification feedback loop is the thing that's not there. And quite often we just focus on the generation of the signal, or the measurement of the signal. And I don't think we've done our job as security people until we've actually understood the entirety of that feedback loop and completed that kind of system of work, whether it's whether that system work is Jira or whether it's in GitHub or wherever it's, wherever it lives, actually understanding that entire cycle and taking some responsibility for making sure that the signaling is high quality throughout.
The difference between just shouting at someone across the room or actually having a conversation and confirming that they've understood and the message has been received.
Exactly, and it's kind of understanding the time horizons of the person you're speaking to, right? It's no good kind of talking to them about something that's going to take 6 months to fix in generally in a weekly in a sprint stand up or something. You've got to be doing that in your kind of quarterly planning and so right signals for right kind of ceremonies and right events is key as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's the again, I don't want to use it necessarily fall back on the context kind of word there, but that kind of, if your feedback loop or your kind of time horizon is daily and this person works on a 2-week sprint, then you can quite quickly work yourself up into a into a bit of bother because you feel like 10 times have passed when for them it's only one.
Yeah, exactly. And we have, we wrangle with that. How do you make that clearer for the resolvers or the responders to the signal? So one of the ways that we do that is we separate out attack detection response from essentially weakness detection response or attack surface management. We make sure those are two very separate operational processes. Now it could be you get a weakness or an exposure which you want to resolve in hours or days, a bit like an actual attack, but it's still a different process. And we're quite explicit that the OODA loop that you apply to attack detection response is different to that amplification feedback loop I just described for an exposure and a weakness, and the timescales are quite likely different as well.
Yeah, okay. Are there any other kind of things that you've done differently or unique challenges to building security in a really fast moving tech forward business? I suppose retail, energy, both kind of kind of pretty quick moving at the moment.
I think I'm not sure there's anything special or unique but I think it is important to focus on the people, and as I say, the kind of the people's perception, everybody's different perception of what good security looks like. And coming back to the security team, quite often for them it's working alongside people who are highly capable and highly accountable for that, and that's the energy. They're getting energy from holding each other to high standards, and it's kind of, yes, there's a bigger picture and there's a bigger mission and we're protecting something and an overall kind of purpose of an organization, which is quite easy to get behind because net zero and decarbonisation is important, but it's almost like it's doing your part as part of a team is that kind of real kind of motivation. I'm not sure that's particularly different, but it's in neither of those cases is the value proposition of security the motivation.
Gotcha.
The value proposition is who you're working with and the bigger mission that you're working to support.
What about where you've got that real emphasis on kind of tech innovation and kind of desire to really kind of up connection with customers or users and kind of inherently, I suppose that's greater attack surface, right? Is there anything there that?
I think yes, maybe it's a faster changing attack surface, but I think there's some there's always opportunities in that pace. In that it's also an opportunity to fix things faster and for things to change faster and think about ephemeral architecture. So you're worried a little less around availability because you've got that ability to just stand something up again or patch something just by starting up the environment again. So there's,
just for folks who might not be familiar, that's where you just you can just build stuff from scratch, right? You just press a button, and so you could, if you noticed a problem, you could kind of just go, right, done with that, destroy that, rebuild it straight away, kind of thing, and replace it with an identical replacement.
And I think but I'd still come back to it's a mindset of the people behind it that is more important than the technology itself. And if you're open to this idea that moving faster can actually equal better security, and things changing faster can actually equal better security, as long as you think about things in a deliberate and designed way and and engineered way, then I think you're on a good path. It's when people are kind of a bit set in their ways of thinking, and I've been kind of guilty of this in the past, and it's I remember pre Adidas days, I was obsessed with kind of threat led and threat intelligence led stuff. We'd done stuff associated with CBEST, which is a regulatory driven testing regime where it's threat intelligence followed by kind of a pen testing or red teaming phase, and similarly kind of in with the European Central Bank with their EU Tiber regime. It was like, right, threat led, threat intelligence led stuff. That's the way. But then you kind of get your head around the user story mapping, and threats are just another definition of what good security looks like. And from an attacker's perspective, our good security is we're putting up we're imposing costs on them. We're a harder target to attack, and even when you do get in, we spot you before you're able to do something that causes that before you get to your end goal. So it's
going right the way back to that aircraft and kind of plane analogy. You're kind of like, how do we not be in the right place? How do we? You're kind of the opposite way of that, right? How do you make it easier to spot people? How do you make it easier to be in the right place at the right time to detect them?
Exactly. Exactly. And then the attacker is just one opinion, along with our engineers, along with our C-suite, along with our our own security folks, along with regulators and everyone else. They're just one opinion of what good security looks like. And yes, there'll be commonality of the things that we do to meet the definition of done for all those user stories. But it kind of, I think that's the kind of the mindset of multiple perspectives of what good security looks like, and that's the real key to working in a faster moving organization. I think is that perception of, and it's the excitement of security. It's the thing that gives me the buzz about working in security, where yet we've got to keep pace with the innovation around technology and understand all the benefits and all the challenges of deploying new technologies, and keep pace with the attackers who are constantly evolving and innovating how they exploit both the new technology and the old stuff. So we've kind of got these competing, we've got two groups of people, the good and the bad, innovating, and we've got to be in the front of both of those. So that's the bit that makes security fun, I think.
Do you bring some of those together through, you mentioned user journey mapping and things like that? Is that some of a kind of tool that you found work quite well in terms of being able to kind of bring those two sides or two groups together? And well, obviously not actually bring cyber criminals or threat actors together, but that kind of persona, if you like, into the security world.
It really helps with prioritization. So you need a common language, and so pick a framework, and it doesn't, from my experience, it doesn't matter an awful lot which framework you pick, but as long as you pick a framework that can then become your common language around risk and controls, and you can kind of write consistent policies and all that kind of stuff. Then you've got how do we prioritize our improvements? And I'm talking about quarter to kind of annual roadmaps or 18-month roadmaps. It's a really good way of prioritizing those, because you've got those perspectives that come in from the different user stories and say, well, there's a degree to which we can predict attacker development and innovation and diffusion of attacker tactics and techniques. There's a degree to which we can predict regulatory changes and other things coming in, and there's a degree to which we can predict what engineers want to see and what C-suite want to see, and what gives them assurance and that sort of thing. So it's a really useful prioritization tool, but it tends to be, for me, useful at the kind of the quarterly and kind of 18-month planning horizons.
Gotcha. And does that feed into how you go about telling some of those stories, or kind of making requests to secure funding and resources and things like that? Is it?
Absolutely right. I kind of, I'd struggle to think what I used to do and how I was perceived before when I wasn't thinking in terms of those kind of user stories. That's for sure.
Right. Um, and the have you got? Is there an example that you can kind of bring? So I think user stories can sometimes mean lots of different things to lots of different people, or can be at different levels. I think sometimes people wouldn't necessarily go, I can't think of an 18-month user story. That's a that's Lord of the Rings rather than something that I might see in a development backlog or something like that. Is there an example that springs to mind that you think might help illustrate how you can take that?
Yeah, I think so. For example, what can we? What's the? So maybe an 18-month kind of user story. We can talk about the evolution of attacks, and in particular, identity-based attacks, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So we could talk about that attacks are evolving. There's an element of scale and commoditization to them, but it's largely at the moment, you know, it's there's a lot of human element to how these are doing, and so but we can see over time it will get automated with the introduction of more kind of Gen AI into the attacker tool set and kind of commoditization of the marketplace and all that sort of stuff. We might be able to see these identity-based attacks reaching similar levels to kind of ransomware, where you've got malware as a service and all of those kind of underlying. So you could tell that supply chain story, you can tell that kind of evolution of the attacker story. And therefore, these are the kind of controls that we want to be investing more in over the next kind of 18 months. So that might be an example of that. And then, like, to your point, you kind of down to the 2 week, we might say, or we've detected, or we know we've got this critical misconfiguration or toxic combination keeps showing up in our cloud infrastructure, in our cloud security tooling, and it shows up time and time again. You're spending an awful lot of time fixing that particular misconfiguration, and so, okay, you're doing a great job of fixing it, but wouldn't it be better if it wasn't there in the first place? And so, we started with a clean container image to begin with, or a known state. You can start to then bring in those. This is the justification for deploying some infrastructure as code, or a known good pattern, or a known good bit of infrastructure.
And that's a really good example, I suppose, of where you can measure the before and after on that kind of time horizon, right? Because you can say, hey, this happened, once a week for the last 6 months, whereas we made this change and now it's only happened once in 6 months. Like, there's a really clear before and after ability to go and measure that. And I think sometimes we get so preoccupied by the big black swan events that inherently happen so infrequently to any organization, let alone your organization, that it feels an impossible thing to measure. But some of those little smaller improvements and incremental changes, actually, they are happening all the time, and making that change that also then makes it easier to update or kind of monitor or kind of adapt in the future is something that you can go and say, well, it's preventing the big hairy black swan thing, as well as the kind of more frequent smaller thing that was kind of causing us a lot of inefficiency and kind of overhead in the meantime. I was just going back. I really like your kind of your 18-month example around identity attacks, and kind of using that as a way of telling a story and kind of predicting the future, and using it as part of your security strategy, or your kind of to go alongside as the narrative for any kind of budget or resource requests and things like that. I think that's a really
particularly something like that. It's because we've seen it before. You and I have lived through the era of AV and kind of the evolution of EDR, and kind of almost as a response to ransomware and scaled malware attacks. We kind of have seen that pattern before. I don't think we know exactly what that's going to look like in terms of scale and commoditization and automation, when the target might be the browser or credentials, but we can kind of make some educated guesses, and
you can have a reasonable forecast, can't you, of it's going to rain,
yes,
or it's going to be sunny today, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Simon, massive thank you for all of that. Some amazing ideas, approaches, tips. I'm sure it's going to be really valuable for a lot of people. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us.
No, my pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
So yeah, that's it for this episode of Communicating Cyber. If something in today's conversation sparked an idea, challenged your perspective, gave you something useful to take back into your team, please subscribe, share it with a colleague, keep the conversation going. Look up Simon on LinkedIn, the best platform if you want to reach out and talk to you about anything you've mentioned today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Yeah, go and have a look for Simon Goldsmith. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment down below or connect with me on LinkedIn as well. Until next time, I've been Robert Oldham. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks all.